It's been one of the greatest joys of my life to have had the extraordinary gift of Hal Holbrook's friendship over 30 years. In February 2017, during dinner at an Indian restaurant in Los Angeles, I'm sorry, is there any way to turn this? Because I can't really read. I think I'm going to need the overhead light because I can't see my paper. The angle of this is weird. Okay, thank you. Okay. In February 2017, during dinner at an Indian restaurant in LA, I told him I wanted to write a book about how Mark Twain Tonight shaped Americans' awareness of Mark Twain as a social critic. I wanted to write about how Holbrook himself had come to see Twain as a critic of racism, jingoism, greed, and corruption, and how his show had made it possible for that Twain to address some of the thorniest challenges facing 20th and 21st century America over its remarkable 63-year run. To my delight, he loved the idea. Neither of us knew at the time that he would decide to end the show 9 months later. From early 2017 until COVID hit in 2020, I had the pleasure of commuting to his Beverly Hills home every 6 or 8 weeks to interview him and immerse myself in his personal archive of marked up books, show journals, show scripts, manuscripts, and press clippings. The result, I hope, will be a book tentatively titled Citizen Twain, How Hal Holbrook Made Mark Twain a Social Critic for Our Time. While the bulk of the book will tackle the impact of his show, the subject of how Holbrook's understanding of Twain grew and changed during the show's first decade provides essential grounding for the larger project, and that's the focus of my paper today. On October 19, 1950, 2 years before Holbrook began to imagine the solo show that would make American theater history, the 25-year-old actor entered the Becky Thatcher bookstore in Hannibal, Missouri, and bought his first book by Mark Twain. He had no idea at the time of the role that Twain would play in his life, or the role that he would play in shaping Twain's legacy. Holbrook and his wife Ruby were touring women's clubs and small colleges, performing a series of dramatic sketches. They didn't have a show scheduled in Hannibal, but it was a convenient place to stop and stretch their legs as they headed west from Terre Haute. They were grateful to Twain for having written the first sketch they'd ever performed for an audience together, one they still included in every show. No matter how hostile or ill-behaved the audience might be, Twain's encounter with an interviewer always left the crowd cheerful. We always ended with the Twain numbers so that we could get off with our lives, Holbrook said. Browsing in the bookshop appealed to them since they were looking for sketches that might find their way into the new program they need to prepare for the next year's season. The bookshop had opened just a year earlier when the home of the model for Becky Thatcher and Tom Sawyer was restored as a period museum with a shop on its ground floor. But as Holbrook perused the shelves, it was not Tom Sawyer that caught his eye. It was a book called Mark Twain at Your Fingertips. It wasn't written by Twain exactly, although all the words in it were his. The pithy quotes and sly quips were ordered, identified, and compiled according to topic by Carolyn Harnsberger. It had been published in 1948 and included citations noting where you could find the lines in Twain's works. He found himself chuckling as he read such gems as, "I was born modest, not all over, but in spots. And when I reflect on the number of disagreeable people who I know who've gone to a better world, I have moved to lead a different life. And there is something good and motherly about Washington, the grand old benevolent asylum for the helpless. And truth is the most valuable thing we have. Let us economize it." There were startling questions like, is the human race a joke? Was it devised and patched together at a dull time when there was nothing important to do? There were deliciously funny lines like, he's useless above the ground. He ought to be under it inspiring the cabbages. And arresting statements like, my kind of loyalty was loyalty to one's country, not to its institutions and office holders. On one level, Mark Twain at Your Fingertips was a disappointment. It contained no dialogue, like Encounter with an Interviewer, that they could use on stage. But the book was good company, and he wasn't sorry he'd bought it. A few years later, when he picked it up again, it would become a roadmap to material that would form the scaffolding of the one-man show with which he would make theater history. At the urging of Bim Pond, whose father had been Twain's lecture agent, Holbrook went into the Argosy bookstore in New York in early 1953 and bought a copy of Roughing It. It looked like a gold mine, he remembered. Raucous early adventures out west that might kick a show into gear early on. Laughs were what I was looking for. Laughs were legs you could move a performance forward on until your anxious heart slowed down. In his search for more pieces that could evoke laughter, he bought the 4-volume Family Mark Twain later that year. It featured stories and essays, as well as The Gilded Age, Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, Connecticut Yankee, and Pudd'nhead Wilson. There were passages that bowled him over, such as the lyrical interlude where Huck says he and Jim would put in the day lazing around, listening to the stillness, a passage he double underlined and marked with 3 vertical lines in the margins and checks and stars for good measure. Or Pap's Call This a Government Speech, a passage he marked with 3 stars and vertical brackets in both margins, underlining every word. Or the thwarted lynching of Sherburne, which he marked up profusely, or the section in which Huck battles his conscience, where he deployed every form of emphasis at his disposal, underlining, bracketing, side bracketing, starring, folding down the corner, and writing, "This is all very beautiful," across the top of the page. The beauty and power of the book startled him. Such a shame there was no place for this material in the show he was putting together. 6 months later, in early 1954, he bought 2 more books, Mark Twain and Eruption, edited by Bernard DeVoto, and Mark Twain's Speeches. Excuse me. Much as humor had been Mark Twain's meal ticket as a lecturer, Holbrook was certain that Twain's humor would be his as well. He viewed Twain as a comic genius and continued to mine all the books he gathered for comic riffs. The closest thing he found had been that had the potential of encounter with an interviewer to get the audience laughing was the sequence he called The Italian Guide, and another he referred to as My Grandfather's Ram. He found the other stuff he was reading terrific, but he couldn't see a place for it in a future show. Over the next 4 years, however, advice given to him by someone who knew Twain, political events that prompted him to buy his first television set, a nightclub show he caught in San Francisco, and a few more trips to the Argosy bookstore all led him to rethink that conclusion. In March 1954, after a performance of his 2-person variety show in Providence, a pianist named Madame Avis Bliven Charbonnel, who had known Twain and his family in Vienna, came up to Holbrook and gave him some unexpected advice. "Don't neglect the seriousness of Twain," she told him, asserting that he was a deep-thinking man. Holbrook realized he hadn't given any consideration to that, but he found himself doing just that shortly thereafter. In April 1954, the month after he met Madame Charbonnel, the Army McCarthy hearings were televised. Holbrook hated Senator Joe McCarthy deeply for all he had done to attack and destroy the lives of his fellow actors. Holbrook and his wife bought their first television set in April in order to watch the hearings live. He was appalled by the way McCarthy had managed to spread a blanket of conformity over the cultural landscape, effectively stifling dissent. "People were afraid to express themselves," Holbrook told me, "and that made me angry. It became one of the sources, I think, of my insistence on trying to make people face up to what was going on and open their minds." McCarthy's big lies and his small ones infuriated Holbrook. Just people who thought and talked about things were being pinpointed as communists, he recalled during one of her interviews. Thought itself had become the enemy. Holbrook says he doesn't remember anything that has happened to our country that gave me a more personal shock. To think that in America, the right to speak your mind was being shut down. The 1954 Army McCarthy hearings, he told me, had a tremendous effect on me, and I think in many ways they drove me straight to Mark Twain without my realizing what was happening. All he knew about Twain in the beginning was that he was a funny guy. But soon he came to realize that Twain told the truth in a world and in a country and at a time when people didn't tell the truth. And that's a quote. Most of these are quotes, but I don't want to interrupt everything with quote, unquote. Watching Senator McCarthy lie underlined for him the fact that Twain was constantly challenging lies. Twain's goal, Holbrook realized, was to get you to think exactly what McCarthy was afraid of. But how do you put that original provocative truth-telling into a show in which he strived to get a laugh every 15 seconds? He didn't know yet. Holbrook desperately needed a break from the CBS television soap opera that paid his bills. And during September 1954, when there was a hiatus in the show, he decided to climb Mount Shasta, stopping in San Francisco on the way. A friend urged him to go to the Hungry Eye and catch a show by Mort Sahl, a comic who was taking the city by storm. He took her advice. Sahl carried a rolled-up newspaper that he sometimes read from and sometimes gestured to. His fearless free associations and digressions came out in rapid-fire staccato bursts of political satire that dazzled the audience. As one critic put it, Saul offered an unscripted tour of a sizzling mind, a relentless cascade of words and images delivered with the rhythmic precision of a jazz soloist, nimbly hooking one observational topic to the next like an anxious party guest with a seemingly endless line of patter. Holbrook was entranced. He had never seen someone do anything like this at a nightclub, or anywhere for that matter. He recalled that his wit had a dangerous political bite torn off the front page. Mort Saul had a dramatic impact on me, Holbrook told me. He was telling the truth. He was breaking the barrier of bullshit that McCarthy had created to keep the public from the truth. Mort Saul crashed through that. Saul was not only telling the truth, Holbrook adds, he was nailing it. He was going for the jugular. He was unafraid. Saul was a counterweight to this horrible giving in to the lies that were being spread by McCarthy, generalized about America, generalized about who we were, generalized about what was important. That was something very important to me. Listening to Mort Saul, Holbrook recalled another voice he had been listening to lately, Mark Twain. Mark Twain cut through the bullshit and told the truth, Holbrook says. No matter where you go in history, you're facing up to a wall of bullshit, if you'll excuse the phrase. We cover ourselves with untruths. Whenever he recognized that, Holbrook found that Twain was staring me in the face. Here's a guy who tells the truth, Holbrook told himself. Why don't you grab a hold of him and use him to tell the truth yourself? He asked. Holbrook recalled some of the witty and cutting truths he relished in Twain, but that he had veered away from as he constructed his show. For the first time, he realized that those truths might have a place in the show after all. If Mort Saul could use a nightclub for getting people to reject the half-truths, untruths, and lies that often passed for conventional wisdom, might Mark Twain be able to play that role as well, he wondered? 6 years later, a reviewer of one of Holbrook's own performances would opine that his show makes clear that Twain was a social commentator whose needling makes Mort Saul's seem tame and unspiced. 2 more books Holbrook bought and studied over the next 2 years played a key role in his reevaluation of who Mark Twain was and why he mattered. In September 1956, he bought Europe and Elsewhere. In Brander Matthews' appreciation that introduced the book, he underlined the observation that a key factor in Twain's appeal was his ability to make his readers think as he makes them laugh. It was a big mistake, Matthews wrote, to ignore the healthy hatred of pretense and sham that pervaded so much of Twain's work. Holbrook came to see that even material that seemed to contain no direct social commentary at all embodied a dimension of Twain's provocative truth-telling. He also underlined Matthews' assertion that the humorist must pay the penalty of his humor. He must run the risk of being tolerated as a mere fun maker, not to be taken seriously. In the eyes of many who do not think for themselves, Matthew observed, Mark Twain is only a humorist. But Holbrook was excited to read Matthews' view that due to Twain's habit of standing upright, of thinking for himself, and of hitting hard at whatever seems hateful and mean, his work actually transcends humor. Holbrook scrawled jagged marks in the margins of these passages and underlined every word. This was the side of Twain that Madame Charbonnel had begged him not to forget. The idea that broader goals inform the humor was echoed in the epigraph to a book Holbrook found in the Argosy bookstore in 1958, soon after it came out. Philip Foner's Mark Twain Social Critic. The humorous writer professes to awaken and direct your love, your kindness, your scorn for untruth, pretension, imposture, your tenderness for the weak, the poor, the unhappy. He comments on all the ordinary actions and passions of life about. He takes upon himself to be the weekday preacher. Twain had marked these words boldly in the margin in his copy of an essay by Thackeray on Jonathan Swift. When Holbrook read these words in Foner's book, he marked them even more boldly, underlining them, placing a star in the margin and folding down the corner of the page. Foner's book, Holbrook told me, had a tremendous effect on me. He read it with excitement and relief. If McCarthy was the disease, Foner's book helped convince him that Mark Twain could be part of the cure. Although he had already been exposed to the dimensions of Twain's work that were the focus of Foner's analysis, reading in Foner's pages ideas that Holbrook himself had scrawled in the margins of Twain's books validated his own growing understanding of Twain's critique. Reading Foner helped him appreciate why Twain was so important to him and why he wanted him to matter to others. Holbrook found Foner saying stuff that I'd never been able to say exactly, but that had been in my heart to say. Mark Twain, social critic, Holbrook told me, became the foundation of my understanding of Mark Twain. He marked up and annotated this volume more profusely than any other book in his collection. The literally thousands of underlinings, marginal markings, and notes with which he filled the book and its flyleaves attest to the intensity of his engagement with it. The Twain he encountered in Foner was not the comic genius that had first attracted him. It was a Twain mortified by the duplicity and arrogance of his country and its leaders. Holbrook found Twain's sardonic critique of racist justice, Anglo-Saxon jingoism, and government greed and malfeasance bracing, daring, powerful. Holbrook now understood what had struck him as a rather cryptic comment when he first came across it in Mark Twain at Your Fingertips. Humor, Twain wrote, sets the thinking machinery in motion. Yes, Holbrook thought, humor worked to help us learn to break through familiar patterns of thought. It helped us see the absurd where we had never seen it before. It encouraged us to question authority. It's pretty simple, Shelley, Holbrook told me in June of 2018. He taught us to think. That's what he did. The fact is, we don't think normally. We don't stop to think. We don't spend time thinking. He slows everything right down and bang, you have to start thinking because he forces you. The humor, along with the satirical, social, and political bribes, prompted us to re-examine things we'd accepted without question before. It helped us learn to think for ourselves. Getting audiences to do that would become Holbrook's goal as well. Holbrook was constantly amazed at how contemporary Twain's comments were, how they seemed to be ripped from the headlines of the paper he read each morning. He came to understand that speaking as Mark Twain, he could get away with saying things he could never have gotten away with speaking as himself. Early on, he came up with a military metaphor to which he would return again and again. Mark Twain would be his sidearm in the ongoing battle against racism, jingoism, greed, and corruption. That sidearm would serve him well as he blasted through the idiocies and hypocrisies of his countrymen during thousands of performances over 63 years. Holbrook used Twain's deftly crafted barbs in all of these areas to shame his countrymen into demanding something better of themselves, of their neighbors, of those who ran the country and its institutions. Throughout it all, the fact that he somehow managed to convey that he shared the same foibles and flaws, as Twain had done, allowed the criticism and the actor delivering it to hit home. For over 60 years, current events shaped the critique of American society that emerged in the second act of Mark Twain Tonight, with different themes becoming especially salient in different decades. During the 50s and 60s, racism and bigotry were at the center of the show. The biggest historical effect on my act, Holbrook often said, was the Civil Rights Movement. During the Vietnam War in the early 1970s and during the Iraq War in the early 21st century, Twain's writings against jingoism took center stage. Twain's caustic critique of the ways in which greed and corruption tainted American politics and business came most fully into focus from the 1980s through Holbrook's retirement in 2017. The show earned Holbrook a good living and brought laughter to millions of people around the world, but they also made people think. Holbrook himself was characteristically modest on this front. I can make them think for maybe 50 minutes, he told me. For maybe 50 minutes I make them think, and then they go home, and that's it. My goal in this book is to prove him wrong. Can I document the impact that his shows had? In a brilliant paper he gave at this conference a few years back, Mark Dawidziak explored how Holbrook's career as Mark Twain helped guide many of our journeys as Twain scholars. I gratefully build on his work. A question at the center of both our projects is how can we grasp and convey the impact of something as ephemeral as a live performance? And I welcome all of your thoughts on this question during the question period and the rest of this conference. Over the last few years, I've tried to reconstruct what transpired during many of these shows by going through scripts, program notes, contemporary newspapers, journal entries, and books by Holbrook and others. I've interviewed Holbrook himself about them, as well as audience members I was able to track down, and of course, mined my own memories of the many shows that I've seen. It's been fascinating to try to gauge how Holbrook's performance of anti-racist material landed in 1958 in a segregated church school in Arkansas, just months after Arkansas's governor had called out the National Guard to stop 9 black students from entering Little Rock Central High School. or to unpack the impact of the show he did in Oxford, Mississippi, 8 days after the riots surrounding the enrollment of the first black student there in 1962, or to probe the reverberations from his daring decision to debut the war prayer at West Point during the Vietnam War, less than 3 weeks after the conviction of Lieutenant William Calley for having perpetrated one of the most notorious crimes of the war. And what happened when Holbrook decided to perform a devastating riff by Twain on a US president's egotism, immaturity, and corruption less than 3 months after Donald Trump took office? Stay tuned. This is the hardest book I've ever had to write. It's also a labor of love of Mark Twain, love of Hal Holbrook. I'm glad I took on the challenge. Thank you.